am Reverend Katie O'Dunn, and I always say Reverend because I want folks to know that individuals with OCD can, in fact, be ordained ministers, but I'm super informal and I'm fine always with folks calling me Katie. My account on Instagram is Rev K Runs Beyond OCD. And I really work at the intersection of faith and OCD. I'm a faith leader who also happens to have OCD. OCD has been a big and painful part of my journey, but in really getting better, in moving through evidence-based treatments like ERP and reclaiming my life, the OCD community has been such an amazing and safe space for me. And I feel so honored to get to work with folks from so many different faith traditions, navigating religious scrupulosity, navigating issues of faith and OCD, and helping them parse out, well, what do I believe versus what does OCD say that I'm supposed to believe? How do I navigate what's meaningful to me, what's hopeful to me, what offers connection versus guilt, shame, fear, and anxiety? So I worked as a school chaplain with students from all different faith backgrounds for a long time. I worked with kiddos who were Hindu and Buddhist and Jewish and Muslim and Sikh and Jain and beyond. And really that work inspired me to do a lot of interfaith work, but also a lot of work around inclusion. Was really passionate, particularly about creating a safe space for my LGBTQ plus students. And as a chaplain, since so many of them, unfortunately, where I'm from in Georgia, did not necessarily have that safe space in their faith communities. So as I shifted from school chaplaincy work to the work I do now, which is scrupulosity, faith, OCD, all the things, that becomes such a key component of the work that I continue to do, where so many folks, in addition to scrupulosity, might be navigating religious trauma or adverse religious experiences because of what they might experience within faith communities. And not only addressing the OCD, but creating a safe space where people can feel loved, affirmed, and seen is so important to me. And seen is so important to me.
Wow. So you have so many passions. You have so many things you're really good at, so many things you're doing, so many things you love. I would love to know, as a person, even for me, like what does interfaith mean? Like if you do interfaith work, I'm assuming it's something between varying faiths.
Yeah. So when I think of interfaith, I think of something that's inclusive of lots of different faith traditions. Sometimes I'll talk about interfaith, or sometimes multi-faith if we're pulling in lots of different aspects. But because of the work that I did with students for so long, I found God, I found the divine so much in the practices of my uniquely awesome students and going to their different houses of worship. And when I started to shift into faith and OCD work in chaplaincy, it was really important for me to carry that with me. So I'm at a point now where all the groups that I run a lot of faith and OCD related support groups, a lot of scrupulosity groups, a lot of groups for clinicians around interfaith literacy for ERP. All of that is based on this interfaith model of really understanding the beliefs and traditions of every single person, and taking a step beyond tolerance to really affirming, understanding, having a deep knowledge so that individuals can be supported. So the beginning of all the groups that I run, we have a big disclaimer about affirming every faith tradition that's present, even if we're talking about scrupulosity, but also affirming all sexual orientations, all gender identities, and making sure, especially when folks might not feel safe in their communities of worship, that is indeed a safe space. So interfaith to me means making sure that every faith tradition is welcomed, and that we are able to speak from our own perspectives, but that we can also include that of others. So I pretty much every group I run, I'll get off and cry and get really emotional because I see in the news, so many different traditions not necessarily affirming one another. And then I get on groups and I see Muslims and Jews and Christians praying for one another in the midst of their OCD and accepting uncertainty. And I'm like, this is what this is all about. And that's a really, really cool thing.
Yeah. Oh, I love that so much. We've talked a little bit in our community about how, like, those of us with OCD tend to just be like very sensitive, hearing of like challenging things happening in the world, even things that like don't relate to us in the slightest. And people have like really resonated with that. And it sounds like you do too. It sounds like you also have a hard time even just knowing that there's all of this like animosity between faiths, and that's part of what's driven your interfaith work.
Very much so. And again, my students inspired that for such a long time, but particularly watching in Georgia, my students outside of the classroom, especially my Muslim students experiencing Islamophobia and really
Yeah.
feeling protective over those students and just their beautiful faith traditions. It really inspired me. And really the way that I ended up shifting into faith and OCD work was I was still serving in my interfaith chaplaincy role. I was struggling a lot with my OCD, didn't want anybody to know what I was going through because what would
Mhm.
people think of the chaplain and her intrusive thoughts and her taboo obsessions, all of those things. And when I started to get better, I realized I had a really unique opportunity because I had a lot of students who were struggling with their mental health in silence. And I actually had lost students from different faith backgrounds
Mhm.
to their mental health struggles in ways that were pretty tough for me, in some ways that my OCD latched onto and blamed me for, all sorts of different things. But coming out of my own journey, I felt like I really had an obligation for those kids from different faith backgrounds to say, okay, I'm your chaplain. And also, I struggle with my mental health too. And I can engage in my faith tradition while seeking mental health treatment. And that saved my life. And when I started speaking up about that in my community, I was terrified. I was it was a huge private school. I was the first female in the role. I was very young. And it was like, what are people
Wow.
going to think of this
Uh,
person speaking up about this? And it was the opposite of everything I had imagined. I started hearing from families saying like, okay, Chaplain K, we can actually tell you what's going on. How do we talk to our priest, our
wow.
rabbi, our imam about the mental health kind of challenges in our family? So it was very neat. And jumping off from there, I started hearing from clinicians in different parts of the world asking for help on OCD cases because I had taught comparative religions for the last decade and knew a lot of faith backgrounds. So helping separate, well, what's faith from what's OCD, and how do we offer support and affirmation? How do we offer culturally responsive exposures?
Yeah.
And started doing that casework at night just kind of to volunteer. And then it got really, really big. And I realized there was a huge need for it, which is why I left my previous role and started an area that doesn't necessarily exist. I work kind of privately in interfaith chaplaincy now with cases all over the place of really focusing on cultural responsiveness and making sure that everyone has a safe space in treatment and that treatment providers really get to understand and affirm the faith traditions of each person.
Yeah. Wow, what a journey you've been on. Like I love it. You have truly like been on such a wild journey, and it's still going. I in some ways it's just beginning. How would you define like scrupulosity?
Yeah. Whenever I talk about scrupulosity, I like to first start by saying that OCD is OCD is OCD. And I think of OCD as really gross ice cream that happens to come in a lot of different, really nasty artificial flavors, but it all happens to be the same ice cream. And that's very much the case, specifically when we're talking about religious scrupulosity, where it is just one of those flavors of OCD that happens to be really gross. And because individuals with OCD have themes about the things most significant to them, OCD always latches on to what's the most important. For individuals where their faith is really important, OCD, of course, will latch on to that. And religious scrupulosity is really just a form of OCD where OCD is latching on to someone's faith, where the intrusive thoughts have to do with their religious practices, with their religious beliefs, and where the compulsions really have to do with making sure that they are living those beliefs out correctly. And I always like to note that this is across faith traditions. It's why the interfaith piece is really important, but
Yeah.
also for folks who identify as atheist, agnostic, humanist. You can absolutely have religious scrupulosity obsessions, even about traditions that are not your own. I see folks often who even who might say, well, I am not Christian, but I have particular themes about Christianity because I'm worried, well, what if I should be? And that comes up as well. So I think it's really important to note it's not just about necessarily your faith tradition, but it could even be about the faith tradition of others.
Yeah, like that's such a great point. It doesn't matter what your identity is, like where you kind of find yourself on the faith spectrum or where you find yourself, practicing and identifying within a faith community. Like OCD is just going to latch on to those things that, as you said, are you most value, so you most care about, and then things that are really, really scary. Like faith by nature is uncertain. There's a lack of certainty there. There's a lot of possibility. There's a lot of different opinions and belief systems on how it is supposed to be done or how it's not supposed to be done. And considering, or, given which kind of religious or faith based community you're a part of, some have really strict rules and regimens and rituals that can easily lend themselves to OCD. So it makes total sense to me that OCD will like latch on to this. And I'm kind of like, I feel, and I would be curious to hear your thoughts, but I think maybe I've read somewhere that like religious scrupulosity is one of the oldest forms of OCD, like documented in history.
Yeah, it is. I've actually been looking at a lot of historical components with that. So my doctoral research is around faith and OCD, and I'm looking and I guess I'll take a step back here with treatment for OCD, which I think a lot of folks listening know that gold standard treatment is exposure and response prevention. But that can be really, really scary for someone with scrupulosity, because it might feel like you're being asked to do something that's really scary, or maybe that opposes your tradition. And I always note that you're never really going to be asked in treatment to do something that goes against your tradition. It will maybe be something that makes you uncomfortable. It's one of the things that I kind of help folks walk that line with, of something that's uncomfortable, but not disrespectful. But even if it feels like you're doing something that's a little bit tough, a little bit challenging, I really believe that it's actually breaking down the OCD so that you can get back to a value-driven version of your faith. That even if you're doing something that feels like, oh, how would God feel about this? I'm not sure. It's actually the OCD in some ways masking as faith in that case. And that by engaging in that, we get to make OCD a lot smaller and reconnect with our faith, maybe for the first time, or for the first time in a long time, where it's not about fear, where it's about meaning and connection.
Yeah.
So a long way of saying my doctoral research is around reimagining ERP as a spiritual practice, where when we can engage in that, we can get back to across faith traditions, an actual value-driven, meaningful version of our faith.
Yeah.
So some of what I'm looking at is really historical cases of scrupulosity, and particularly founders in early on in faith traditions, where individuals have attributed some of their brilliance in religion to their scrupulosity. And I've been kind of arguing, well, they were also really, really suffering. And yes, they did some beautiful and meaningful things, but if they were able to get ERP, maybe they could have stepped forward even more. Maybe they could have lived out their faith in an even more beautiful, value-driven way, that they actually got to connect with God as opposed to fear. So that's a big piece I'm looking at in my research.
Yeah. Wow, that's really interesting. Yeah, that's very cool. And I'm going to be curious about your research and some of the things that you find over the course of this process for you. I also think, and I think that's a great way of saying it too, that like the point isn't that OCD makes us better at anything. The point isn't that OCD makes us more devout. And it's not a quality that we want to be respected within faith or outside of faith communities, right? Like it actually serves as a barrier for us to practice our most values-led spirituality, to, seek and be really curious about what's out there, about what makes us feel good, what makes us feel whole and valued. And my personal experience, and then kind of based on how many individuals I've spoken with in the community at varying levels of treatment, is that like, it was never about the faith, because just as you said, like it's just a flavor of the ice cream. It's never been about the faith. It's never been about the content. It's always been about the process, basically, of latching onto those things you care about, making you doubt yourself and make you feel really uncertain about things.
Well, it's so much. So all day, every day right now for me is devoted to religious scrupulosity. And unfortunately, I see a lot of individuals across faith traditions who also have experienced some really difficult components in faith communities. whether that is an adverse religious experience or religious trauma or discrimination in some form. And I see a lot of folks in the LGBTQ plus community who have not felt lifted up in the midst of their identity. And I think it's really important as individuals go through OCD treatment, whether it's for scrupulosity or any subtype, to be affirmed, to feel like they are loved, to be told and know that they are, in fact, created in the image of God. I always learned from one of my students a long time ago. We were at the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and we were talking about tolerance. And it was actually one of my LGBT students looked at me and was like, Chaplain K, I do not want anybody to tolerate me. That's dumb. I want people to love, affirm, accept, and understand me for every aspect of my identity. And I think this intersection of faith and OCD, it is so important for the LGBTQ plus community to really feel that love, when that has not always been the case in faith communities. And when individuals also might feel stigmatized because of their mental health, we need to create a space at the intersection of these two places where folks do feel loved, affirmed, and seen for the uniquely awesome individuals they are.
I love hearing specifically your student being able to like identify within herself. Like she's like, I don't actually, tolerance isn't enough. Like, I don't want to be tolerated, right? I want to be embraced. And I really feel that that's the case with all diverse identities. And so the point isn't to tolerate them. The point is to embrace them, to be excited about them, to, consider them as the wonderfully kind of complex strengths that they are, and then invite them in. Like that's kind of where we're heading, I think. And so I would love to hear a little bit from you too. I know you had mentioned, so with scrupulosity, with ERPs, and yes, you mentioned it is the gold standard treatment. That's absolutely true. Exposure and response prevention is the gold standard treatment for OCD. It's usually always going to be our kind of frontline defense with OCD, and it is a notoriously really difficult kind of therapeutic process. It can be painful, it can bring on a lot of emotions. It also has a really high success rate, which is one of the reasons why we love it so much. So would you mind talking a little bit, Katie, about, what kind of ERPs would you advocate for in Scroop? And then what kind of ERPs were the ones that you were saying you wouldn't be asked to do? Like what is something that people might be kind of commonly fearful that they'd be asked to do that you wouldn't advocate for?
Yeah. Oh, this is like my favorite ever question.
Okay.
So I actually always show, when I do trainings on this, I always show a chart, and
Okay.
ERP to be effective is essentially we have to be exposed to something we fear. So we have to be a little bit scared, right? We have to be a little bit nervous, but I never think that means crossing over a certain line of our values. And I want folks to hear that you are not going to go to treatment and be asked to, well, I always love the 80-20 rule, do something that 80% of others in your congregation would refuse to do. You're not going to be asked to oppose your dietary restrictions. You are not going to be asked to completely stop doing a religious practice that is meaningful to you. You are not going to be asked to not keep kosher. I mean, it's things of that nature, but you probably will be asked to do some stuff that makes you a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe to name an intrusive thought in a really scary place. Maybe to draw something that's a little bit scary. Maybe to say an intrusive thought out loud. Maybe even to think something kind of scary while you're in the midst of a worship service. I think the line there is different for each person. So I'm naming a couple examples, but I think it depends on the individual. And I always think about what is discomfort versus disrespect for each person. This might be different within each sect or within each denomination of a faith tradition. And it's one of the reasons I love working in this area, to really parse out, okay, well, this is what others in your community might be doing. How do we do something uncomfortable that's still within the bounds of respect within your tradition? How do we get creative? And to determine sometimes what that looks like, I always ask individuals a question. I always know we are never going to be excited about doing an exposure, or it's probably not a really good exposure. I have never once walked into ERP and said, I am so pumped to do this really hard exposure today. But in the area of religious scrupulosity, I love the idea of asking someone why they don't want to do it. And if the answer is, well, it feels really scary, it feels like something bad might happen, it feels like God might be mad at me, probably a fantastic exposure. We can sit with all of that. And really across traditions, we can sit with the idea that, you know what, if the divine is all powerful and all loving, God can handle this exposure that we're doing over here to get better. Like we can
Yeah.
sit with that. If the answer is, I don't want to do that because it completely opposes my faith and everything that I believe and what everyone in my faith tradition would do, probably not an exposure that you're going to be asked to do.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I think, and unfortunately, I think that that line has probably been blurred and or crossed in certain settings because ERP has been something we've learned as a community over time what's helpful, what's effective, what's useful. And what we found is that getting to the core fear or specifically getting to, how we're getting back to our values has been really useful and a great motivator going through this therapy. And that was certainly the case in my experience as well. And sometimes folks have, for example, a really common way that scruples show up, and we can talk about this a little bit more, but a really common way that scruples show up is a lot of times folks will fear having blasphemous thoughts or thoughts that are rude or swearing at God or, whatever it is that feels really offensive. And so we know we cannot control our thoughts. So imagine trying to be like, I can't think that, I can't think that, I can't think that. And of course, all that happens is those thoughts become louder. You're experiencing them more frequently. And because you can't control them, you'd feel a strong sense of shame, guilt, and fear over offending this kind of your creator or whoever it is that you're worshiping that you value more than anything in the whole wide world. So I think like that's a great example of like, most people can understand why that's so scary and why there's so many emotions that come up with that.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's such a great example. I see this every day where someone will say, well, why am I still having these blasphemous, intrusive thoughts? And it's, well, because you don't want to have them. And anything that we don't want to have is going to come on stronger. And that's a great example of an exposure that really I kind of ask people to do each and every day, of allowing those thoughts to be there, naming those thoughts out loud. And I often go back to this space of saying, you know what, in doing that, you are not opposing your faith. We can accept uncertainty around that, but
Yeah.
most likely we are making the OCD a little bit smaller by naming that and by saying it out loud, by being willing to sit with that, by allowing that thought to be there so that we can move towards the things that are actually meaningful to us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point. I want to pull up some of the questions because I want to make sure we have plenty of time to address them. How do you determine what are your values? I feel like OCD has taken everything. There's a little bit more to that question, but I think even that is a really great place to start.
Yeah. So I think it's important to note that OCD makes it, we did a town hall on this actually last year, makes it feel like your values aren't really your values. If OCD is latching onto something and twisting it, it's probably because it is the most significant thing, the most important thing to you. And it at the same time can be really tough because you're sitting there and you're thinking, well, what am I moving towards if OCD is telling me that I have to be fearful of this particular thing? And at least for me, in my experience, determining my values was looking at what is OCD latching onto, and how do I do the opposite of what OCD is telling me to do around that particular thing. In moving through ACT and values card sorts, I mean, a lot of my values have to do with love and compassion and connection and faith. So of course, I have moral scrupulosity. It latches onto every aspect of that. It makes me feel like I can't connect with people, like I'm not compassionate enough, like I don't deserve to have interactions because what if I'm a dangerous, horrible, awful person? So for me, figuring out what those values are is saying, well, OCD is latching on to that. They are probably it probably is indicative of my values, and I'm going to move towards those things anyway. If OCD says I'm not allowed to have relationships with those around me, I'm going to go out and I'm going to have those relationships. I'm going to connect with folks and do all of the things that OCD is telling me that I can't do.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. It's almost like this, like my pushback or my taking back power is finding the things I love and connecting with them in a really big way.
Mhm.
And like what could be more autonomous and driven by the dignity and like worth of each person than that? Like that's the perfect marriage. I love that. Some of these are a little saucy, mind you.
That's
So
okay. We can be
we might
saucy.
face them. Yeah. Um, is it possible that supporting trans identities is affirming compulsions?
Is affirming compulsions. Oh, so I would say no, and here's why. It's very different to have an obsession about if to be navigating sexual orientation or gender identity OCD, and to actually identify as trans and to be in the midst of transitioning in a very authentic, value driven way. Individuals should have the opportunity to be in gender affirming care. And it is not affirming compulsions to say, hey, we are with you throughout this transition. We support you. We affirm you. We are going to use your pronouns. We are going to affirm all that you are navigating. Having OCD in those areas is very, very different, because that would be ego dystonic rather than really supporting someone through what they are authentically experiencing.
Yeah, wow, you said it so well. I love it. The only thing I think I would add is just for folks that don't know what ego dystonic means. So when Katie says ego dystonic, and we kind of talk about this a lot with OCD, when we say ego syntonic or ego dystonic, what we mean is it either aligns with your values and kind of who you are as a person, and dystonic is going to be it doesn't, right? And so a lot of times intrusive thoughts, all the time, intrusive thoughts fit into the category of ego dystonic, meaning they don't align with who we are as a person. They don't really align with our values. We don't really want to be having them. They kind of are in dissonance with who we are as people or our personalities and so on. I will create a kind of a caveat here that sometimes OCD can fall on a spectrum of ego syntonic and ego dystonic, certain obsessions that might come up. I've noticed for myself, particularly when I'm extremely triggered, like I will start to feel like, actually, maybe this does align with my values, right? I really want to be a clean person. I really want to be a good person. I really want to be a loving person. And so it can feel like it gets a little bit murky, but in a very clinical way, like ego dystonic is going to describe most of OCD symptoms most of the time. And that's certainly true with this. And so, Katie, I love that you kind of emphasized that, because like we are all these whole, entire human beings outside of our OCD. OCD is something that we have and that we experience, but it's not the entirety of who we are. And so we can certainly have these multi-layered, complex individual identities that are in no way related to our OCD, right? I can be trans and have OCD. I can be queer and have OCD. I am queer and I have OCD. And so, it happens all the time. Now, that's not to say that individuals may not really struggle with some of those obsessions and compulsions, as we talked about with gender identity OCD or sexual orientation OCD. But those two experiences are very, very different things. And part of what a clinician who specializes in OCD and who is LGBTQ affirming can do and help you find is the difference between the two and what's going to work for you and what's going to be best for your kind of recovery. That's my 2 cents. That was really like 50 cents. It was
No, but
like a
it's a
whole
great
dollar.
50 cents. It's
A
a
whole
great
entire
50
dollar.
cents. And for folks to hear too, it's really interesting, because we automatically, and I think sometimes in the question we'll jump to, oh, well, is that affirming a compulsion? And it's important to note that OCD, it's going to oppose your identity in any way, shape, or form. So individuals who identify as trans or non-binary might have obsessions about being a cis male or a cis female. And similarly, really any individual in the LGBTQ plus community might have an obsession about something different, where we often assume that someone is going to have an obsession about being a part of the LGBT community. It can go either way. Whatever your identity is, you can have an obsession about having an identity that differs from the way that you identify.
Oh, so true. I'm so glad that you said that too, because yeah, that's one of the reasons why we call it sexual orientation OCD and not homosexuality or HOCD as we used to in the community. Because what we learned is like, aside from the fact that it's, maybe not the best way to frame it, it's actually just simply not accurate. It's not an accurate way to describe it. Yeah, it's just wrong. Because the reality is like we all can, and I certainly do, have, experience with obsessions or intrusive thoughts around varying sexual identities, varying preferences, varying gender identities. And again, this is kind of like what we were talking about with scrupulosity and like faith community identities. It's because it's not about that. It's never been about that. It's never been about being gay or not being gay. It's never been about being non-binary or being cis. It's always been about how well you know yourself and trying to create doubt and uncertainty in how you know yourself. That's the point. So it can really latch on to literally anything. Yeah, great question. Let's say, how do you respond to people who say God says we're not supposed to be gay?
Yeah. So this, and I'm going to try to not get emotional. Like this just stabs me in the heart and in the biggest way. And I guess first, I'll say two things rather than getting into a massive theological argument on here and trying to speak on behalf of lots of different faith leaders. I would like to just say I am so sorry for folks who are a member of the LGBTQIA plus community who have heard that. And it's just crappy and just wrong. And it is not true. And without, again, I could go all day into why I think that there are different interpretations of scripture that are significantly more accurate. But at the end of the day, I just want everyone to hear you are affirmed, you are loved, you are valued, you are created in the image of the divine. And the way that you identify, the way that you are is beautiful and is awesome. And if you're hearing that from different spaces, I know those aren't a safe space for you. And I'm also really, really sorry that you have that experience. And I think particularly for those who are in the OCD community, who are also in faith communities, I really believe that, yes, we are called to advocate for mental health within our faith communities. I also think we're called to advocate for the LGBT community to make sure that everyone has a safe space. If that is our call as advocates in the OCD community, we want to make sure that everyone that's a part of our community feels welcomed in all of their spaces.
Wow. You were like, I'm not going to get emotional, but then I was like, I'm going to get emotional. So meaningful to hear. Thank you for sharing that, Katie. And there's nothing that's, inherently right or wrong about this other than providing space for all people to get the best community and the best care that they possibly can. And that's our goal, right? The entire purpose of our existence is to provide people with life-saving, necessary, and vital mental health care. And mental health care has to be affirming. It has to be inclusive of all of our kind of complex identities, because when it's not competent care. It's just not competent. And so, thank you for saying that. I really appreciate it. Yeah. So the next question is, what if I'm not sure about my gender identity? So I think this question is so broad, right? Like, I appreciate the person that asked it. And there's so much context that we would probably need to be able to effectively answer this. I think given the information that we have, I'd be really curious about what you mean when you say you're not sure. Like, what is that experience like for you? Are you experiencing a lot of suffering? Are you experiencing a lot of maybe ruminating or mental compulsions? Are you thinking about it a lot? Or is it just something that, like so many of us are going through and have gone through, you're curious about, and there's not a lot of distress associated, because then it might just be part of your identity. It might be something that you're excited to explore. Usually for me, it's kind of like, is there distress? Is this disrupting day-to-day life? Like, those are kind of the cues that I'm like, there could be some anxiety or some OCD going on here. But without knowing that, I think that's the best answer we can probably give. Katie, I don't know if you have any 2 cents to add to that.
Yeah, you just described everything that I was thinking and trying to articulate much more beautifully than I was going to. I think what you spoke to that I love is this idea of genuine curiosity versus kind of fear and anxiety, and really thinking through kind of throughout this process, am I feeling this just genuine curiosity, this kind of exploration, versus where the OCD and anxiety piece might come in, which is again, fear, guilt, disgust, urgency of I need to figure this out right now. And I think being able to separate those two things, we would need to know more fully to answer that question. But regardless, want you to know that wherever you are, whatever the answer is, that you are loved and affirmed.
Yeah, absolutely. What resources do you have for individuals who might be experiencing this, whether it's the intersection of being queer or LGBTQIA and having OCD, or the intersection of having, religious scrupulosity and being those identities, like any of the intersection between those three? Do you have any like books or kind of resources that you would recommend for folks?
Yeah, so this is super important. And I think in terms of resources, both I always push everyone to both NOCD and the IOCDF, where there are lots and lots of LGBTQ affirming resources. On the faith and OCD side, where that intersects, the IOCDF, I got to build with an awesome team, a faith and OCD resource center, where we have resources for every faith tradition, along with faith leaders, clinicians, and individuals with OCD. And everything there, we have really worked to make inclusive. And through there, you can sign up for SIGs, you can sign up for advocacy efforts. I also run weekly support groups as well that are really focused on interfaith inclusion, but also the intersectionality with really everyone's identities and making sure that they feel affirmed. So I would highlight NOCD, IOCDF, all of those resource pages. And I want folks to know that if you're showing up to anything with NOCD or IOCDF that relates to faith and OCD, there is also going to be a focus on creating a safe space for the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's always going to be true. And, those are two organizations that I know have taken extensive measures to make sure that we're providing affirming of all identities care, to make sure that we're providing, care, mental health care that doesn't just tolerate individuals, but embraces them for exactly who they are. For hiring and fostering working relationships with individuals who are taking into account your complex identities, taking everything about you as an individual person into account when they're helping you build a treatment plan, and doing so in a very collaborative way. These are all things that I think we can speak both for the NOCD community as well as for the IOCDF or the International OCD Foundation as well, because those are both organizations that have really prioritized that. And that's everything. We really care, that's really important.
And that's been, I mean, for me, so I've had the chance the last 3 years to really work on faith and OCD initiatives with the IOCDF. And that's been such a priority for us, especially on the LGBT side, where individuals show up really to a lot of our faith and OCD events who have not been affirmed in faith communities. And it, again, is so wrong and breaks my heart. And I have so many feelings and emotions about that. And it is why we need to so make sure that we are creating those safe spaces. And I hear from folks a lot. And if you are in this boat, please know that I truly mean this. I get emails often of, is this group, because it's related to faith and OCD, is this a safe space? And I want you to hear that that is my commitment. That's the IOCDF's commitment. That's NOCD's commitment, to make sure, even if you see the word faith in it and faith has not traditionally been safe for you, that we
Yeah.
want it to be a safe space where you feel loved and affirmed. And yeah, that needs to be a part of what we're doing. And that's really what we strive for. I run the IOCDF Faith and OCD Special Interest Group, which is an advocate based group. We actually are pretty big. We have like 280 folks registered for that group right now.
Mhm.
And it kind of varies who comes each month, but our focus is on inclusive advocacy initiatives around faith and OCD, with, of course, offering affirmation to everyone. And we meet the second Monday of each month at 7 p.m. Eastern. It's open to everyone. And then I run out of my organization, Faith and Mental Health Integrative Services. I run Wednesday night weekly support groups for faith and OCD every Wednesday at 7. There's different variations. I run stuff for clergy. I also run stuff for folks with OCD. And I have interfaith prayer time as well that focuses on accepting uncertainty and creating safe spaces for folks who traditionally haven't necessarily felt safe within their faith communities.
You're busy. You're so busy. You're doing so much for the community. I love that. And Katie, can we get more information about that if we go to your Instagram? Is that the best place to kind of get updates and times and all the specific logistical information?
Yeah, if folks head to my Instagram in the and I can send direct resources to you too, but if you head to the link in my bio on my website under faith and OCD support, I have all of the stuff that I offer around faith and OCD, as well as links to SIGs and free support groups and all sorts of different things. I want to acknowledge that this has been a tough Pride Month for folks, and that there has been a lot of discrimination in ways really that I haven't seen previously. And for anyone who has experienced that, I'm so, so, so sorry on behalf of a faith leader and someone with OCD in the community. I'm just sorry that you've experienced that. And I want you to know that you are amazing. You are seen. You are valued. You are enough. And I am so, so sorry for that hurt. And just want you to know that we need to create safer and more welcoming spaces. But in the meantime, I'm just so sorry. And I want you to know that you are loved. Other piece I would say to you is across faith traditions, and I really believe this, across faith traditions, our faith teaches us love, teaches us compassion, teaches us acceptance. And really our shared journey then with OCD reminds us of the importance of empathy and understanding. And when all of this comes together, I just think it's really important for us to have our faith and our journeys with OCD guide us towards greater love, acceptance, and shared experience, so that we can all support one another. Because this world is a pretty awesome, or it can be a really hurtful place, but this world can be a really beautiful place when we recognize the diversity and the unique identities of each and every person. And to quote one of my former 7-year-old students who used to say, Chaplain K, the world would be super boring if we all believed the same stuff, loved the same people, and looked the same way. I would agree. And it can be a really, really beautiful place in our faith communities, in our OCD communities, if we learn to love, accept, affirm, and appreciate one another.